Hello everyone, this is Erik, the Asian movie enthusiast, and this is my review of The Legend of Evil Lake, a Korean action movie from 2003. The film opens with the massacre of a primitive tribe by Silla's first king and his technologically advanced army. The Auta tribal chief, in his death throes, vows vengeance against Silla, and their blood and resentment fill the place where the sacred tree was standing. It magically turns into a lake. To seal off the Auta tribe's force of sorcery, he drives his holy sword deep into the sacred tree. The narrative then resumes nearly 1 millennium later, circa AD 896, as Silla is showing problems of strain and the court is beset by constant rebellions. Queen Jinseong, troubled by the threats to the throne, leans on General Biharang against the counsels of her ministers, and this dude strives to save the country. But he's also weary of the endless battles, so he becomes betrothed to Jaunbi, the daughter of an executed rebel, who he hopes to settle down for a peaceful life. Unfortunately, while he's away fighting, Jaunbi is chased by assassins, and in a panic she removes the sacred sword from the tree, releasing the soul of the tribal chief. So one cool thing about The Legend of Evil Lake is that there is a fantasy vibe to this, alright? So the movie kind of opens with a shot of a blood-red moon. You get this like cultish ritual involving a woman dancing on the edges of swords. And you notice a few similarities, actually, to Hong Kong wuxia movies in terms of wire work that's used to have people jump long distances or fly in the air. Which is pretty cool. And there's also a slight horror vibe as well that's supplemented with the fantasy stuff during certain moments. And this mix of different genres and subgenres helps to make this an entertaining watch. The film looks pretty nice. There are some big palaces, like sets or actual locations that they use, and related areas look legit. Lots of forest environments as well as some water visuals and fog. Performances are pretty solid. Some of these actors I did not recognize or I wasn't familiar with, or maybe I just don't remember because I haven't watched many of their films in a while. But the story and the characters in this are pretty common. And we have this kind of nice mix of genres to play with. But I would say, as a criticism, like none of the individual characters really stick out, especially when compared to other fantasy movies that we have out here. They're more like tropes instead of compelling players within the story. So, for example, like our male lead could be described as a good warrior who's really in love with this one girl who seems to be a good girl, and that's kind of like your description. There's not a lot to chew on in regard to each specific character. They're a bit on the generic side, and they do lack memorable, multidimensional qualities. This flaw is what prevents The Legend of Evil Lake from becoming like a fantasy classic or a Korean classic. However, these stock characters are elevated to a degree by the conflict and the fantasy elements that surround them. So when the evil spirit is unleashed, it engages in a mix of like direct physical attacks as well as manipulation and deception. And this kind of throws the characters into like this quagmire. And it makes their lives quite difficult. So the girl at one point becomes possessed by the spirit, and you cannot tell whether or not she can be saved. Do the protagonists, are they going to be forced to kill her because the spirit resides in her body? Or is there a way to reclaim her soul and eliminate the spirit when it's separated from her? So it's kind of interesting. You're not really sure how the final act of the film is going to go. The runtime is only 1 hour and 32 minutes long, which really helps the pacing. There's not much dull filler in this, and that's good because like the characters, as I said, are not complex enough to really dedicate like a 2.5 hour fantasy film to. So they did a good job keeping the runtime down in this, and the story progresses pretty rapidly. So these are all big positives, I think. There is a good amount of action in this. This is not an action-packed movie, but there's enough. You get an opening sequence that's pretty good. Some flaming arrow attacks, some wizardry on display. There's a multi-location action thriller scene when the male protagonist is fighting in a war and his girl is attempting to escape a murder attempt in a completely separate location, and it bounces back and forth between them. And that was, I think the movie kind of kicks up a notch during that scene. Multiple sword fights break out. The choreography in this is nothing special, but it's effective enough. As this is fantasy inspired, there are some, I guess, fantastical effects at play, like wind-generated pushes on enemies, kind of like remote control over weaponry and other items to like throw at enemies, long-range attacks, so to speak, from the fantasy type thing. One of the cooler scenes in the film involves this evil spirit. It storms the royal palace and takes out like a few dozen soldiers. Probably my favorite scene of the film. The death scenes in this are actually kind of bloody. You get dismemberments and decapitations, which is always nice. And one other criticism I might have, though, in this is that the finale in this film is merely pretty good. You get some of these cool scenes that pop up throughout, but I think the finale, if they really threw down an awesome, badass, like, action scene to finish the film, it would have kicked the film up another notch, and given it a more longer-lasting impression, but it doesn't quite do that. So I would say, I haven't seen this movie in almost 20 years at this point, and I felt like rewatching it and reviewing it. And I'm glad I did. It's like, The Legend of Evil Lake is a pretty entertaining, fantasy-based action flick with a hint of horror in it. And I think this nice little blend of elements gives it a nice level of entertainment value. I moderately recommend this. Just don't expect a fantasy classic, okay? It's currently available streaming on Amazon. And if you have seen this one, what are your thoughts on it? And as always, folks, I'll see you next time.